Good morning, good evening for some of you joining us today. My name is Hansy Barraza. I'm a visiting faculty member teaching at the GSD this semester. Today, I'm thankful for being brought in by Roberta, Chair of the Urban Planning and Design Department, and by Mark Lee, Chair of the Department of Architecture at the GSD, for allowing me to share my seminar, my work at Harvard that looks at the contributions of women of color, specifically queer, Black, Indigenous, Latinx, Asian women that have contributed to the built environment. Today's event has two parts. The first part is about archiving and the importance for archiving. Architect Roberta Washington will be lecturing about the history of Black women in architecture in the United States. The second part of today's event is about rethinking and transforming the timeline. The idea behind this came from my amazing students enrolled in the Hidden Figures seminar. As a way to reclaim the exclusion of queer and BIPOC women's contribution in the design field, often excluded from the canon of knowledge, Transforming the Timeline, a student-led initiative, seeks to reinstate authorship over the history of the built environment. Their intention was to uplift a powerful, diverse set of voices that have shaped the world around them through their leadership in design, activism, and art. The panelists invited today actually originated from the students' research work that represents those diverse voices. I would do a full introduction of invited panelists following Roberta Washington's lecture. Before we begin, I want to give a special thanks to Claire Wang and Celeste Mator, who were my research assistants. I'm indebted to both of you, and to my students who made this seminar so much fun with your insights and conversation to move the needle closer to racial justice. So my students in seminar, if you can say and wave hi.
Hello.
And lastly, to Naisha Bradley, Assistant Dean of Diversity, Inclusion, and Belonging, and to the Racial Equity and Anti-Racism Fund Selection Committee for providing funding to allow for this event to occur. I will now turn to introducing Roberta Washington. Roberta Washington, a graduate of Howard University and Columbia University, who has written extensively on the history of Black architects and women architects, with her biographies appearing in the Biographical Dictionary of African American Architects, 1865 through 1945, and in the African American National Biography. She is a former president of the National Organization of Minority Architects and has been a principal of Roberta Washington Architects since 1983. On a personal note, I was introduced to Roberta Washington through a dear architect friend of mine, Peter Robinson, who I just introduced you earlier today. Last night, he texted me the following about Roberta. Roberta Washington was the first architect I ever met, and I remember it as it was yesterday. She spoke at my 10th grade architecture studio in New York City Public School, the High School of Art and Design. She wore a cream suit, and we thought she was a queen. She talked about the profession, her work in Africa, and her practice. She made Black architects that day. I was honestly never burdened by issues of representation in the field, probably because Ms. Washington was the first architect I met. So with further ado, I'll leave it to Roberta.
Well, thank you. Thank you. That's some introduction. Yes, so let me just collect myself and start now. So I've always been interested, I shouldn't say always, I've been interested for a long time in understanding history and investigating the history of Black architects, but also of Black women in architecture. But it really started when I was the president of NOMA back in 1997, and they had a historian who said that whatever it is that you want to look into, let us just tell me. And this was Vincent McKenzie from Auburn, who said, okay, I'll look it up. You know, this is what you do. I do. And so I said, well, without question, let's talk about women, you know? And he brought me back some information, which was the first time I saw that the information that we generally accepted as what is true about Black women in architecture was not exactly correct. And what he presented was a little write-up about what he knew about Black women in architecture, and that was that Norma Scalaric, who we normally think of as the first Black woman to be licensed, wasn't actually, and who we also thought of until that time as the first Black woman to attend Columbia University, that we found out later that that's not true, but it's only because someone started investigating and someone kept archives and someone had the curiosity to look at things and challenge and want to know more and want to go further. And so this slideshow that I'm presenting today is a slideshow based on what happens when you do start investigating more, and where can it take you? Not just you, but others, to a whole other level of knowledge and understanding about what's really going on in the world around you. So with that, I'm going to go to my presentation, and you can see this, I'm trusting, yes? Right. So I'm going to start with something that may seem like I'm going back too far, but I don't think you can go back far enough. If you want to talk about the existence of Black women and Black people in architecture, you have to look at the history. Where did we come from in the profession? And when did we start? And when could we have started? And so to do that, I'm just looking at, in terms of architecture in general, the fact that it was only like in 1845 that the first Americans started traveling to Paris to study architecture, right? And in 1853, there was the first architectural firm, so-called firm, because it was larger than the one-person firms that were operating until then started, right? And in 1857, the American Institute of Architects was founded. And in 1863, the Capitol Dome was finished. And so what is the importance of knowing what came before? It's easier to understand like what our place is in time. What could we have done earlier? Could we have started earlier than this? At this particular time, most African Americans, or at least many, were still enslaved. And it wasn't until 1865 that the Civil War ends that Black folks in general are considered free. And that maybe for the first time, Black folks had an opportunity to think about what they wanted to be in terms of a career, rather than to be someone's servant or to be a part of someone else's idea of your place in the world. It may have just been only after the Civil War that Black folks and other folks too were able to think beyond their immediate life before the Civil War and during the Civil War. There was a Reconstruction period, which didn't work really well for a lot of reasons, but there was a period when Black folks were considered free and thought they were free and thought that this was it, but it didn't last long enough. But during that period, Black men especially got a taste of what it was like to be considered a regular citizen, but too short a time. During this time, in 1875, the first woman, Mary Page, is graduating with a degree from the University of Illinois in architecture. In 1875, also Calvin Brandt, who was an architect in DC, a person who made himself an architect. He was never enslaved, he was lucky enough to get a job working with a white architect. And as far as I can tell, he's probably the earliest African-American who started practicing architecture with his own firm. And in DC today, there are churches and there are other buildings still standing that he designed. And he also had a son who came to New York and ended up in Buffalo, who was also an architect. Okay, good. But just to, went back too fast. Oops. Oh, goodness. Excuse me. Yeah. Okay. So, but the point is that when could the first Black woman have been working as an architect or thinking about becoming an architect? Probably around this period, probably after Civil War ends, of course, but maybe even after knowing or hearing about Calvin Brandt, and also about hearing about Robert Taylor, who was the first Black architect to graduate from MIT and who relocated to Tuskegee and started what became the earliest African-American school. So now this made it possible to have a place, a school that could educate African-Americans, but men primarily, not women, who wanted to think about becoming an architect. And I believe that the first African-American architect was licensed in New Jersey in 1902. But although I'm really talking mostly in my presentation about early Black women who are licensed, I'm also looking at Black women who functioned and knew they wanted to design a building before that period. And these are a few of them. These are probably the best known ones. And it's just, sometimes I find it like just mind-boggling to think that there were Black women after the Civil War, maybe a couple of decades after, but after the Civil War, were thinking that, hey, they could design a building too, right? That somehow it wasn't like going to the moon. They didn't think of it as something that was out of their reach. They thought of it as something that they had to do. And that's, I guess, how I see it. I think that in terms of professions or hobbies or doing something or over and over again that you want to do and that you like to do, how did you get, I always think of the question, how did you get to have that interest and where did it come from, right? And so sometimes we can't ever know, but sometimes we can. So this first person, Elizabeth Carter Brooks, was living in New Bedford, Massachusetts, and she was lucky enough, and it's just a whole bunch of coincidences or their stars lining up a certain way, but she went to a design school. She went to a school that was funded or ran by the Quakers. And she was like allowed and selected to do this. And she actually studied design, right? She lived in New York for a while in Brooklyn, and then she ended up back in New Bedford. And this is the only building that I think they have a real record of or a photograph of that they know that she designed. And this was an old folks home and it was done in 1906. So in 1906, there was a Black woman designing. That's like amazing. But of course, who knew that? For like how many years did we not know that? Because it's not like knowledge is like instantly known and shared by everyone. But anyway, so it was fantastic to find out that she was there. In some cases, as I said, people learn because of what's around them and even their families, right? And so in the case of Ethel Madison Furman, who lived in Richmond, Virginia, except for the time when she came with her relocated with her family to New York in Harlem, and she worked in Harlem for an architect, and probably the probably the first architect. And she worked there for at least a year. And it's interesting because some of the other books that write about her, write about Furman, say that she must have gone, her family must have sent her to study in somebody's office and paid them and whatever, because at the time, that was how many white females who wanted to do architecture, but whose family had money, did it, right? But I think in this case, this isn't the case, that she came and she was actually able to get a job. And she worked with E.R. Williams, who is a pretty much unknown Black architect in New York City at the time. But he was known, or he's maybe better known now, as the first architect to design what on the Mall, a building which is now the African American Museum of History and whatever. But in 1926, E.R. Williams was the architect chosen to design a building, and did design a building for the Mall, and had money from Congress, but had infighting, as like always, and so there was no building. But I'm saying all of this to say that Ethel Madison Furman worked for this person. And in the census of that year, she referred to herself as an architect. Her father was a contractor. Her father designed many buildings in Richmond before the family relocated. And the brother, one of her brothers, was also following in her father's footsteps. But I think she followed in her father's footsteps, but in another arena, and that was architecture. And there's a picture in the center of the slide that shows a group of men meeting, and with her in the middle. And this is what used to be an annual meeting at Hampton Institute of Black contractors. And it seems that one year her father could not go, and she represented her father. And she was, I think, all into architecture and construction. And the last person is Amasa Lee Meredith, who was in Petersburg, Virginia. And she also had a very close connection with New York. She was a teacher, and she ended up setting up the School of Art for Petersburg College. I can't remember now what it is called, but it used to be Petersburg Negro College. But she set up the School of Art for that department. But she studied in New York. She came to New York, and she studied at Columbia Teachers College. She got an undergraduate, she got a master's degree. And I think while she was in New York, she may have seen one of the first exhibits from the Museum of Modern Art about the international style, which might explain how she designed a house that has been that's on the registry of it was on the National Registry as one of the first early examples of an international style house. And it was done in 1938, but I think that it shouldn't be so unusual if you think that she was in New York during the time of that exhibit, and she may have applied what she learned and saw to her style. But not only did she design this, but then she designed many other houses, but only a few were ever built. She and her sister relocated to New York, and they established an area in Long Island that became a special area for Black folks wanting to get closer to the beach. And she designed several of the buildings that were there originally. And in the corner is one of the drawings of her buildings. Excuse me. And so I think that's like a history before there's a history, right? Because they weren't licensed, there wasn't a chance to be, and they may not have been interested in it. This is in a magazine cover from 2007 that talked about, and probably the only magazine cover ever devoted to Black women in architecture, but it talked about the number, the low percentage, the number of Black women in architecture at the time as being 0.2%. And I can say that it's changed a little since this article, but not a lot. And we'll just go through some of that. But these are also some other early women who were very interested in architecture. And these two sisters, the Cassell sisters, were daughters of an architect who was working at Howard University. And they were also early graduates of MIT in architecture in the 40s. And they one worked as a designer of church buildings in DC, and the other was worked building did naval architecture. And the thing is, I think that in some cases, if they had been a male, because they did have a brother who was who became an architect, I think if they had been male, their father would have also seen that they had to become architects. And I don't think it was open to them, even though they had the education and they had the willpower, the will to do it. So I think sometimes it's a lot of other things. It's like luck and who you know and how people help you along the way that makes it possible for you to do whatever. Beverly Lorraine Green was licensed in 1942. And her story is that she was born in Chicago. She went to the University of Illinois. This is a picture of her as the one female and the one person of color in this group of civil engineering students. And one of the things that about her career, the start of her career, is that she actually had a start. And it was based around her being connected with some Black architects and politicians who were interested in building housing for African Americans who lived on the South Side, which is where she also lived. And this is a story about how this group of African Americans, architects, and primarily architects and planners, came together and proposed a building of a housing complex. It was not approved in Washington, DC, but what did happen is that the housing authority came into being in Chicago, and they decided to do a housing project for Black folks on the South Side. And this group of people remained involved, right? Beverly Green once was invited to a party when she was just 22 years old with important Black architects like Robert Taylor Jr., who was the son of the first Black graduate from MIT. But also at this party, it was actually a party for Paul Williams, who was the most famous architect in the country at the time. But the fact that she was even at a reception party for him shows that even at that young age, she was seen as something special, and people and other Black architects respected her, even though she was young. But she did do other things. She was very interested in her sorority, and she did a lot of projects to support young girls in her neighborhood. But the most important thing that I think she is known for, or should be known for, is the fact that she was part of this group of architects and drafters who still is not really acknowledged in history that they did participate and that they did have an opportunity to design. And Beverly Green was, during this period, just before the conclusion of these buildings, named as an architect given the title of architect for the Chicago Housing Development Corporation. So she was recognized not just by her peers and other Black architects, but she was recognized citywide, at least. And so she ran a part of the design process here. And then as things happen, people decide they want to go someplace else. So she moved to New York. She worked for Stuyvesant at Stuyvesant. She was going to work at Stuyvesant Town. That didn't quite work out. But she did meet people, and she met several important Black architects. She already knew some from Chicago, but these are also her mentors from New York. And she worked with her mentors, and she let her mentors do whatever they could for her. She also, because there was an organization called the CANA, which was the Council for African American, for the Negro architects. She began to meet other architects, and there were several white architects who were prominent members, and she worked for those architects eventually too. And it included several famous architects, but before her untimely death, like in 1957, she also designed a couple of projects for groups in Harlem. And I think the important thing about Beverly Green to remember today is that she pursued architecture with a vengeance. She really wanted to do it, but she also had other interests that related to the Black community and people who she thought needed additional assistance in it. Louise Harris Brown was licensed in 1949, and she, although she was from Kansas, she also went to school in Chicago. But her most important thing is probably that she met Mies van der Rohe in Chicago. And it was like a chance meeting. She was in Chicago visiting her brother, who was going to school was studying engineering. And he told her about an evening class or an evening session that was open to non-students. And she attended this class, and that's where she met Mies van der Rohe, who she later wrote had like a profound effect on her life and what she was doing with her life. And part of the evidence of that influence is that she did go back to Kansas. She got her degree in architecture. And then she came back to Chicago, and she studied engineering and got a degree in engineering, although she never got licensed as an engineer. And this is an article from a Black magazine, Ebony, which is talking about the fact that she's one of a few, one of only two, I guess, at the time, Black women who are licensed, but that she was really interested in engineering, which I found very curious, because when I read that article at first, but it was only after I found out more that she studied engineering, and she worked for a firm. She got a job working for a firm doing structural engineering, and she actually got to design two of the design or work on the structural systems. I don't know, maybe not design, but work on the structural systems or doing the structural drawings for Mies van der Rohe's, two of his buildings and several other buildings. And she got this because she went to work she had worked for Roderick O'Neill, who was a Black architect in Chicago, and she worked there for a while. And then she worked for Frank Cornackers, and he was the structural engineer of Mies van der Rohe. And she worked there designing buildings, designing structural systems with others, not trying to say she did it alone, but she was part of a crew, and she was it seems at this time anyway, the only female in their office. And then she left because she thought she needed more, she needed a better she needed a better template to work with and more space. And she left and she went to Brazil because she also thought that Brazil had less racism. And and so she went there. She worked for large firms, American firms that had transferred there at first because it took her a while to get her Brazilian license as an architect. And once she did, then she started designing her own buildings, and she designed housing and other small buildings for clients who she met there. And she stayed and practiced there until 1993 when she came back to the United States and died of breast cancer. Norma Skolaric was licensed in 1954. And Norma was born in New York City and attended Columbia after attending Barnard, which was a prerequisite. And so she got her degree. And she also worked with the groups of Black architects, including the ones who had this exhibit. And she was always like sort of called out as the first, because after the previous architect had died that I just spoke about, it was like Norma became known as the first, and people forgot that there was another one before. But she spent her time like working with other Black architects, and anyone, not just Black architects, actually. She had less sessions on getting registered, and she worked at various firms herself after she got licensed. And her thing was to combine her life with children, but doing her work with helping other architects or want to be architects advance. And these were all the things that she was good with. And these are some of the buildings that she was the project manager on, or the designer. And she did start a firm of her own with others. And this was in 1985. Siegel, Skolaric, and Diamond founded an architectural firm, which lasted for several years. And I think she said that she left because one thing is that she was really used to the large projects that she had become used to at the other previous firms. And Norma also became the first Black woman to receive a fellowship from the AIA and also the Whitney M. Young Award. And then following her in 1958, there was Henrietta Hartney, who was a Howard graduate and who I knew as someone who was working she worked for the Department of Health, but she also worked with other hospital agencies. And later we worked in the same building once when she worked for a construction company. And Christine Belvinton, who was I think it was the first female African-American to teach at Pratt University. And she was licensed in 1965, and she was interested in interiors. And I think she's still alive in France, I think. But she was very interested in doing daycare and other kinds of projects that involved children. And she also had some interior design projects published. And Nada J. Williams was licensed in 1972. And she worked for Sears, or not Sears. She worked for a large sales company like Sears, something like a Sears. And and she was one of the first women Black or white, to join an organization for people who worked at stores who ran the interiors, who planned the interiors for Sears and other types of department stores. So there was an organization, there may still be. And this is just some documents about when Black women started to get organized. And one of them is about the forming of an organization in 1982 of Black women in New York. And then later there was another organization formed, and that one didn't last. And there's another one which also did not last, but there's still others in Baltimore and in Washington, DC. And then I think the drive was that Black women wanted to talk to other Black women, and they wanted to have a chance to exchange not only ideas, but also to sort of reinforce the fact that, it may be difficult, but hey, you're not in it alone, kind of thing. And so it was all in the 80s. You can tell from our dress code that we were still looking as a group, I'm back there somewhere, and finding out, and we're so happy to see that there were other Black women who were doing it. And so we were glad for the opportunities to come together. And Howard University and the AIA convened what I think was the first national meeting where Black women in architecture could meet each other and could share and talk. And that was at Howard in, what year was that? I think it says 82 or 83. And then this is just some of us, and here I do include myself, women who have an office or had an office. And I'm showing this to say that I think that the result of all of that history is that now there are some women, Black women, who are able to work for others, but also to develop their own work within their own space. And so I'm just sharing that. And now there are maybe 500 plus of us. This is Garnett Covington, who was licensed in New York and North Carolina, and who was one of the women who organized the first women's group of the first group of Black women in architecture. And I think just counting in numbers now, we know that there are not that in terms of men in architecture, Black men, that out of 116,000, there are maybe 2,300 Black men. And for women, Black women, like I say, we're at 500 or a little over 500. But I think that being able to share history and to have other people who can comment on it and understand how we came to where we are, it can be, I think, encouraging for other folks, because I think that it's the way I see it, Black women have had a really rough time in terms of becoming anything that they want to be. And so I think that the fact that we know about this group of Black women who started out without any mentors or others to show them the way, and to see that they've made it is encouraging enough to make it worth sharing. So thank you very much.
Great, thank you so much, Roberta. Thank you for that lecture, and really wonderful on time. You gave us 10 minutes of a break until we move to the second part. Roberta, I hope you can join us for the panel discussion.
Yes.
Yes, awesome, great, thank you. Thank you so much, Roberta. And I know that my students have a lot of questions for you and the other panelists. I'll see you at 11 o'clock. Okay. I'll see everyone at 11 o'clock. We can take a little break. Thank you. Hello, welcome back. Welcome back. If everyone can please put their camera on if they feel comfortable. And this is just to let you know that this is being recorded and it won't be made public until we have full consent from our speakers today. But I will ask you, if you're comfortable, to please put your camera on during our panel dialogue and discussion for part 2. So as some of you might not know, my name is Hansy Barraza, and I'm currently a visiting faculty at the GSD. I am so excited to present to you part 2 of the session on kind of having a dialogue and conversation about our invited guests. Before we do that, I did ask all our panelists to provide a 5-minute kind of presentation about who they are, what they do, and why they do it. And before they do that, I would like to give 1 or 2 sentence kind of brief introduction and really let our panelists speak about themselves and their work. So the presentation is in order. So starting the first presentation is going to be Marcela, Pardo, Ariza. Marcela is a non-binary visual artist, curator, and art worker that explores the relationship of representation, intergenerational kinship, and queerness through constructive photographs, site-specific installations, and public programming. Our second presenter is going to be Dr. Lily Sung. Lily is a lecturer in urban planning and design at the GSD. Her research focuses on infrastructure-based experiments that centers the experience and insights of historically marginalized groups as foundation of reparative planning and design. Our third presenter is going to be Jessie Hemphill. Jessie's love for her community has led her to working with First Nations and organizations in Lower Canada through her community planning practice, Alderhill Planning. The fourth is Kristen Jeffer, founder the Black Urbanist radio show in 2010, which continues to be a resource for Black urbanism at the intersections of feminism and queer and trans life. She covers her thoughts on design, urban planning, transportation, architecture, and life as a Black woman in the modern world. And then we have Wenyu, who we're excited to also have as part of the panelist discussion. Wenyu is a Chinese architect and professor of China Academy of Art. She co-founded Armature Architecture Studio with Wang Shu, located in Hangzhou, China. The work is known for its use of natural material and traditional technique. She has previously taught at the GSD and is currently a visiting professor at the University of College London. Wenyu will do her presentation and will have the assistance of Claire Wang with the translation if needed. And also joining the panel discussion is Roberta Washington, architect Roberta, who we just heard for the first part. So with that, Claire, if you can stop the screen share. With that, I'm so excited to have Marcela begin, and what the panel discussion after the presentation is really going to be run by my students. My students has all the questions for you, and I'm just going to moderate it. They're just so excited. They're the ones that brought you here. So thank you again for sharing your work with us.
Totally. Hi, everyone. Thank you so much for being here. I'm very grateful. I always think that we're sharing space here for a reason. So I just want to acknowledge that. And thank you, Hansy and Claire, for making all of this possible. I'm going to share my screen and just sort of give you a glimpse of my work and what I do. And then we can get into conversation and questions. So my name is Marcela Pardo Ariza. I'm a Colombian non-binary artist, curator, and art worker. And I'm originally from Colombia. I moved when I was 16, and I've sort of been in the art world in so many different iterations. And one of the things that I'm always thinking about in terms of my work and how I came to stage photography is this idea of having a set as a site of possibility to create sort of like a space for us to exist and be our fullest selves. So I'm going to share this body of work, which I did in 2018, which was kind of looking at queer archives and juxtaposing them with folks that are living here today, and really thinking about this sort of transhistorical kinship, like how do we honor and celebrate those that came before us, and sort of creating these links between time, while also creating these frames where multiple images coexist at one time, sort of questioning this idea of linear time. This is another photograph that was part of that. And for me, when I started doing photography, there were all these arbitrary rules about it, like how you hang it in the space, how to make it archival, all of these sort of things. And photography is such a young medium that I was always so hesitant to jump into this sort of arbitrary framework. another reason why I went into photography too is just because I saw so much lack of representation for, you know, people like me and especially trans folks. And I was always just looking at, you know, the representation that we have for trans folks is always so violent. And I'm always interested in sort of creating, like, how do we center joy as a side of resistance and resilience, right? And how do we celebrate each other and show up for each other in genuine ways? And with that being said, I think that in this, you know, in hearing Roberta talk about this, and thank you so much for sharing your wisdom with us. There's something that I would think about in terms of exhibitions and visual art is that we create these objects and we just sort of put them everywhere and without really considering the space that they're in. And for me, there's always this negotiation with the space, like how do we collaborate with spaces rather than just arriving and like taking it, which to me feels like such a colonial gesture of just like arriving and making it your own, or like arriving somewhere and like changing the music. There's always this sort of like, how do we take a step back and like listen to what the space is telling us and like negotiate with folks. This was an exhibition that I did in 2019 and really thinking about the relationship of bodies and queer bodies and large bodies with the space and really the idea of like taking up space. And for this, one aspect of my work is about collaborating with people that we wouldn't normally collaborate with. And so I collaborate with visual artists, but I also like collaborating with writers. And for this one, I was collaborating with Bridget Tover, who is a fat activist. And she's doing like such an amazing work in terms of like, you know, critiquing diet culture and like how oppressive it is for most people, but mostly women of color. So we were just sort of taking her writing and thinking about how do we put those ideas into space and invite people to think about space differently and their own bodies interacting with it. And similarly with that, one other aspect of my practice is, you know, how do we see that pleasure is political and that like we can use this sort of like visual imagery that we haven't yet seen to create, to kind of celebrate curiosity and sort of like create spaces where we can explore ourselves. And this was a collaboration that I did with Vulgar, that is an organization in Mexico City that does sex education for youth. And we always sort of think about belonging through materiality and like kink, and as a side of just like generating different types of knowledges that create bonds and like affective bonds between people and sort of making visual culture that represents that in a way that is not, you know, the typical sort of like male gaze that we're also tired of. And now just before I finish, I want to mention like this, you know, since the pandemic started, then I was in San Francisco at the moment and everything was sort of like boarded up in this very apocalyptic way. And I started collaborating with Juan Carlos Rodriguez Rivera, who's a designer, and my friend who was a bartender. And we were just like talking to businesses and being, you know, how do we sort of give more of a poetic energy to public space? So we were creating these posters with them, and the posters had like links to the fundraisers of the employees. Because we know that, like, you know, one of the industries that has been the most affected by this has been the service industry or like gig workers. And so we were just trying to like link the poetics of the space and like the businesses that were like mostly queer owned, Latinx owned, and women owned, and sort of like distributing funds, which is like another part of my practice that I'm always very interested in. I'm like, pay artists more, you know, pay people generously, like honor their time. You know, just don't be rude, very basic things. So, you know, that sort of poetic thing that we were working on at the beginning of the pandemic sort of changed with the racial uprisings. And we started to collaborate with the only POC curator of the San Francisco Museum of Modern Art. And the museum is going, you know, through so much work that needs to be done. And because I work with archives so much, one of the things that we were interested in was really creating an image that was like a testament of the times, and sort of like all the critiques that were going for the museum. and that it, and not only the museum, but like all art and cultural institutions, and so many more, of course. And for us, it was just like we collaborated with many people to do this gesture that like hopefully is not just a gesture, but like it's followed up by like concrete actions. But for us, it was very important that this was part of, the museum has never been closed, and this was the only thing that you could see in its doors. And so by doing that, this image is in their own archives, which basically is really what we wanted to do, sort of infiltrate that history that is generally like just not trying to include its own critique, right? And with that, similarly, I did this project called King Streets, also in 2020. And this was the first image before the pandemic. So it was in my studio, everyone's like maskless, and like they're all very tenderly holding each other. And again, it was taking images from the past, which is the black and white ones, with folks from the present. And it ended up being like a very long project. It ended up being 18 photographs, 60 collaborators. And I was just sort of like meeting people where they were at. These are folks from the transgender district, which is the only district, like transgender district legally recognized in the world. This is the Stud Collective, which is sort of like a queer collective that owns like the oldest bar in queer bar in San Francisco. And the idea was just to sort of honor all these folks. I called this project a love letter to the LGBTQIA community in the middle of 2020. And also because these posters were in public space, there was also this idea that like when you were outside in the bus shelters, like there were all these queer folks waiting with you. So I'm just giving you a quick glimpse. But this is what it looked like. So it was on Market Street, and you could just sort of like stroll, and there was this sort of like parade, even though like downtown was completely empty. So there was this weird juxtaposition that I wanted to like point to, and also, working with people that were mostly like performers, like DJs, producers, sex workers, and so on. I just clicked it. And I just wanted to, this is the last slide, in all the work that I've been doing with sort of, realizing that the art world can be very exploitative and not very nice. I started to create this group with my friend Kat Chutaris that was really about sort of like, how do we look at our handling differently? There's always like how do we make it like a better industry? A lot of artists are also our handlers. And so we are sort of incorporating folks that like generally don't get hired for these gigs. So we're just trying to make the workplace sort of like more equitable for them, and also creating like a community that works with institutions to make like better and safer workspaces. So that was very quick and a lot of info. So thank you for listening.
That was really wonderful, Marcela. Thank you so much. That was great. We now are going to have our second speaker, Dr. Lily Song.
Thank you. Thank you, Marcela and Hansy and Roberta, for sharing your work earlier. I'm Lily Song. My gender pronouns are she, hers. I'm in Somerville, Massachusetts on unceded Wampanoag territory. And today, as I speak with you, I'll just kind of follow Hansy's formula of, who are you, what do you do, and how did you come to this work? So I've got some slides that I'll share. Okay, so who am I? I consider myself a movement-aligned reparative planner. So I was trained as I am an urban planner. For me, this means using my creative power to accomplish frontline communities and organizers who are already leading the charge against extractive systems of racial capitalism, heteropatriarchy, and colonialism or coloniality. And also striving to heal communities and commons and our planet. What do I do? Let me show you. So at Harvard, I've coordinated something called CoDesign, which is a school initiative to tighten links between design research, pedagogy, activism, and practice. I'll share some examples of projects. So my reparative planning and design pedagogy, research, practice, and activism, sisters, place-based activists, and community-led initiatives. So this is one with the Alliance for Community Transit Los Angeles. I've led a team of planners and designers to develop environmental design strategies for community safety without police on transit and public spaces. And there's more info about all these things online. As a co-lead on the Mattapan Mapping Project, I'm helping build an anti-displacement mapping and advocacy portal to inform strategies by the Greater Mattapan Neighborhood Council here in Boston to participate in spatial planning and redevelopment processes. My co-design field lab class this semester supported Unica Rogers-Sip, who's here pictured in the middle in the yellow shirt, and her Destination Design School of Agricultural Estates in the Black Belt South as they do regenerative planning and design work. So our class created story maps, power maps, and future histories that made a case or make a case for the Black Belt region as a fount and staging ground for a reparation-based Green New Deal. And here's one of our students up top, Sarah Smith, who is sharing out her team's future history on mobility. And these teams included both Harvard and MIT-based students and Black Belt youth from the region. And in my personal capacity outside CoDesign and the GSD, I serve on the board of Kota Kita, which is a nonprofit participatory planning organization in Indonesia, which you may know is one of the world's greatest democracies, and it's also a decolonizing and multi-ethnic society, and definitely a region of climate vulnerability as well. And besides this work, I'm a consultant to the city of Burlington, Vermont on their strategic plan for racial equity. And I'm working also with the city of Greenville, Mississippi on a catalytic public realm strategy to harness local assets for more inclusive development. So how did I come into this work? I actually came into planning from a community organizing background. I used to work in South LA with the Asian American Drug Abuse Program and Community Coalition. Community Coalition was partly a response, it's partly an Asian, Black, Latinx solidarity initiative that was started in the wake of the '92 LA uprisings. I guess coming into planning and design, I was really struck by how BIPOC communities were and are defined by deficit and damage. And this is completely inconsistent with my own experience of BIPOC communities, which are resourceful, entrepreneurial, very generous, and so much more. And so I guess this is my wall of sort of teachers. And maybe that's why through my master's and PhD and postdoc and I guess lifelong learning journey, I've gravitated toward Black radicals and immigrant rights advocates, labor activists, trans leaders, radical feminists, and Indigenous designers as my mentors, teachers, colleagues. And I was trying to think about why that is. And I think it's because they help me circumvent the narrowness and toxicity of dominant culture. And support me to work in more humane and dignified and joyful terms, and also support me to interrogate my own privilege and also to express power with others. So that's the end of my slideshow, but I'll conclude with some reflections, and I've been really sitting with the provocation of hidden figures, and I think I've come to the point where my conclusion is that from where I sit, BIPOC women are hardly hidden figures. They've been leading design and transforming our world since Harriet Tubman, architected the Underground Railroad, collectively speaking, of course, and, building infrastructures of freedom. It's very usual and unsurprising for me to see women like Unica, who was pictured earlier, or Alensa pictured earlier, Sarah pictured earlier, who are just like, I don't know, leading, and being awesome at what they do every day. So the question that comes to mind is like, hidden to whom and why? And whose sort of gaze, and definitions of architecture and design continue to be centered. And why is that, and while informing and educating people at different entry points, how can we uphold our own sort of creative agency, our own internal diversity and the contributions that we make on our own terms and in ways that serve us, as well as like bring, more of us from the margins to the center, like Bell Hooks said. And I think as BIPOC women designers too, I'd love to discuss more what we need, what will nourish us. I think her stories that Roberta shared, like they nourish me. When I see the photography, from Marcela and just that overall perspective, I feel very nourished. And, these are the kind of spaces and conversations, the resources, like being paid, right? Being honored, doing dignified work. So these are the kind of, community conversations that I'd like to have more going forward. Thank you.
Thank you so much, Lily. That was really wonderful. To continue on, you have some really great beginning questions. To continue on, we're going to go to Jessie Hemphill.
Great. Gelakisla, good morning, folks. Nuko amtlali logula. Ayakan la knakotau tluligwitlau tlumeti. Gelakisla snanemuk. Gelakisla Hansy. I'm Jessie Hemphill, or Tlali Logula, and I'm a white passing Indigenous woman, straight passing queer woman, able-bodied cisgendered woman, and I live in the west coast of Canada on Vancouver Island, British Columbia. You can see a little map there of where I'm joining you from today in Snuneymuxw unceded territory, and I am an Indigenous planner. My home community is the Kwasla Nakro Nations, which is in the Kwakwakiwak Nation, and I also have Métis heritage from my father's side. I'm a founder and senior planner with a company called Alderhill Planning. We're 100% Indigenous owned, and all of our work is Indigenous serving. We either work directly with Indigenous communities, mostly here in British Columbia, or with Indigenous organizations, or with government and organizations in Indigenous realms, policy development, program development, decolonizing. I'll talk a little bit more about that in a moment. I also have the privilege of leading the practicum in Indigenous planning, in the Indigenous Community Planning Program within the University of British Columbia's School of Community and Regional Planning. We have a lovely annual cohort there, and one of my colleagues, Leonie Sandercock, is joining this morning to tune in. I also am an adjunct instructor at Vancouver Island University here in Nanaimo, where I teach a course on Indigenous planning and supervise students. And so very quickly, the work I do within Indigenous planning is very tricky to describe. It's very broad and flexible, but just a few of the types of projects that I do. I've been in Indigenous planning for over a decade now. I started coming out of an undergrad degree in linguistics and Indigenous studies and dropped in my home reserve community to lead something called comprehensive community planning, or CCP, with no planning background or really facilitation training or anything. Learned about planning from my own nation, from my elders, from making a lot of mistakes, from little kids, from people who showed up and were learning along with me and teaching me as we went. So comprehensive community planning, strategic planning, we do a ton of that, policy development, a ton of community engagement and communications, decolonization, indigenization work. We do a lot of training and mentorship. So I spend a lot of time working with up and coming Indigenous planners, often outside of the formal education system, to build up their, I like to say, planning intuition. Not that they're an empty bucket to be filled up with like normative planning skills, but that they already are tuned into their own communities, planning practices and knowledge. And my role often is to give them some technical skills to mobilize their intuition and knowledge in the service of planning for their own nations, their own people. I do a ton of facilitation, process design, and more. I'm not going to go through all of this text because I know time is short, but I was asked specifically to talk about how I approach decolonization and indigenization in my work. And I thought that the thorn and the rose image are kind of appropriate to show you how I think about these two things. So for me, decolonization is about undoing the harm of colonization. It's about dismantling, tearing down, pushing back against. And I list some structures there and also some practices that are embedded in colonization and white supremacy and patriarchy and, synoptic rational planning. So the decolonizing part of my work is pushing back against those, especially when they show up in mixed spaces where Indigenous people are experiencing harm as a result of colonization, or where federal, provincial, local government policy is causing harm to Indigenous peoples because of the colonial impacts embedded in it. My preferred space to work in is the indigenization space, which is really about honoring the fact that all Indigenous peoples across the globe have ancient planning traditions that are as sophisticated, as urban in many cases, as technically miraculous, as effective as any that we know now that have come out of non-Indigenous planning realms. And I imagine the same goes for BIPOC folks across the globe as well. And so at the same time, we can't generalize about what Indigenous planning looks like. It means different things in different communities. And so again, my role is typically to work directly with individual communities, either like spatial communities or kinship communities, to reawaken, revitalize their traditional planning practices in the modern context. There's so many incredible examples of what that looks like, and one aspect I'm thinking of right now in the context of COVID is thinking about our traditional practices in my own nation around collectivism and an ethic of care and how that's imbued in our planning, and seeking to use tools like Zoom and virtual community engagement tools to connect with each other and support each other in an ongoing way, even though we can't meet in person in the big house the way we might have. So, and I've listed again some structures and some practices there that are tied in my mind to Indigenous planning that I seek to reawaken. I'm not going to have time to go through this in detail, but happy to share this with you. For me, the grounding theory behind Indigenous planning is webbed systems. So the idea that everything is interconnected, the micro and the macro. So my behavior, my actions, my words at a personal, interpersonal level are inseparable from my work. And as many of you have been talking about, my reawakening joy in this work and connecting to the nurturing aspects of planning and seeking to create joy for others creates these ripple effects that translate into policy at the regional, national, global levels, right? So I'll just show you quickly, like, these are some of the elements of the web system. So basically in my work, I'm trying to pay attention to the dynamics I'm awakening at all of these levels and how they feed into each other, and recognizing that nothing is disconnected. And that influences planning. And then just some bullet points of what that looks like in my practice. The sort of last point I want to end with maybe is just that for me, Indigenous planning, again, is not about a specific set of practices or approaches, but seeking to support Indigenous self-determination. So seeking to create space for diversity, flexibility, iterative approaches to community building, to design, to planning. And so at the end of the day, my question for myself and within our company, our question for ourselves when we look at new work that we want to take on is, does this work support Indigenous self-determination? And so for those of you who are planning to work with Indigenous peoples, I encourage you to think about that question. It's not about us knowing what the best practices are for Indigenous peoples. It's about, and I don't even want to use the word enabling or empowering or supporting, because it's not always our role, but upholding, respecting the right of all Indigenous peoples to be self-determining, even at times when that conflicts with our individual values or what we see to be effective. And at the end of the day, asking also, does my work support Indigenous well-being? Does it bring me joy, and does it bring others joy? That's the only way we can be sustainable in this work. So with that, I'll say Gela Kisla, look forward to the questions and hearing the other speakers.
Thank you, Jessie. That was wonderful. Thank you so much. We have two more speakers. Next is Kristen Jeffers. Kristen, you're on.
All right, good morning, everybody. Let me go ahead and get my slides up here so we can keep moving here. I'm actually going to go all the way back to my beginning. I was testing everything out. So let me hit slideshow here. So once again, this is me. I'm pictured out in front of, this is Kansas City Union Station. So just a heads up. So I consider myself a Black queer feminist urbanist. And I would also like to comma that with a Southern, and Southern in the sense of the designated U.S. South, which of course we are all unpacking all of these designations. So let me move forward to just why I write. It's just like breathing for me. That's where I start. When I submitted, I thought I was going to design school at NC State, and I submitted a portfolio of songs to the design school. Ended up in the communication department, and I've been a friend of the design school ever since. And that's just where it starts. I wrote my first children's book, which incorporated elements of thinking about how things take up space and what these jams and jellies, literally jams and jellies, were going to do at the age of 6 in 1993. And so that also ties into why I craft. This little image I found when I was pulling together these slides. Some of these images are my own images. Some of these are from stock imagery, and I kept it in there because it does tell a story. And so much like I tell a lot of my space making is storytelling, it also is directly associated with my relationship to fiber. Much like I had access to pens and pencils, there was always a sewing machine running in my home. I'm from Greensboro, North Carolina, which was a textile capital, but of course that has changed in this next wave of industrialization that we faced. And this pandemic really made me sit back and think about how supply chains and such have changed, much like the reason I care about urbanism. This is a photograph of a Food Lion grocery store, which at one point was a Kroger grocery store. Kroger is now almost multinational, and so is the parent company of Food Lion. My parents brought me to the grocery store with them. Being in a city in North Carolina growing up, our perspective around urbanism and urban planning, and I use urbanism as sort of a catch-all. Of course, this is a word that for me is broadening. And it's just this relationship that I have with, okay, my parents raised me in a place that some people look at as low density, as a suburb. My grandparents both lived on farms that they managed to obtain. And of course, going back into some of this history, a lot of what Roberta shared, and for me, a lot of that history, even in other disciplines that I've been in, I've not been privy to it. So when I decided to create a writing project around the concept of space and place, I only went by what I could find on Google, because at the time, particularly why I care about Black urbanism, of course, I'm going to be building up in this miniature slideshow on the different intersections and why they're in my work. This particular textbook, which I made, like the slide just created itself, it was just unfinished. It had Black voices only in a certain political space. It only talked about us being in urban spaces and housing projects, which is, yes, a part of our story, but only a slither. I did not see myself. And so, like many of you all who came to the seminar, many of you have found my work, many of my co-presenters, I said, okay, this isn't enough. In the written record and I have a Master of Public Affairs from the UNC Greensboro, and that's where I was doing this work and encountering this work. I said that the written record of our governance, like our existing governance, and of course we're unpacking that and decolonizing that and doing all those necessary things, but right now it's not enough. We need to be centered as Black people, as Indigenous folks, as people of color, and of course I said I have to do this. So that was 11 years ago. And then once I recognized my gender identity and sexuality, I do use she, her pronouns, but I functionally live as a non-binary femme. And partly because I am rejecting some of what's been given to us for gender identities and sexual identities underneath a bounds of previous enslavement, colonialism and of course the capitalism and such that we live under today, all these different oppressions, but of course moving to a joy space. And of course my partner Les, who identifies as a masculine ascender lesbian, Black, also from Virginia, as well as got roots in Alabama on her father's side. Most of my people are based still in North Carolina. We're both tracing our legacy. And of course, we're creating a legacy together here in DC, where we both live. This was a couple summers ago. This was well before this pandemic. But yeah, that's our two gender presentations, our experiences together. I realized that there was even more to this. You know, I'd had this Black lens, I had this sort of feminist lens, more of a heterosexual feminist lens. And then once I, tapped into our queer, trans, non-binary community, I realized there's a whole different set of intersections and labels and such. And so that's what got me into creating. It is technically a canon and I'm calling it a school, but right now what's most centered about this project is that I said, okay, there are Black women, there are queer people writing the books. I don't want there to be any confusion when it's time to assign a text or even just to go to find the names of these people. So I've added, you can go on, I have the Kristen Jeffers Media Bookshop store that has some of these texts. My other site, the blackurbanist.com/resources, you can find these resources. And I just wanted to give, since we do these syllabi have become popular. In fact, it is 5 years to the day that the Lemonade syllabus hit us and hit the world. And just in the spirit of these great works of Black women's art and music and such, prompting creation of academic syllabi. That's the thoughts pattern that I had here. And then I've also finding out where other Black queer women and queer people are, finding out what spaces are we thriving in, finding our concentrations of people, specifically around houses of faith, around, and then me personally, I'll talk about this in the next slide, of course, what my fiber craft looks like now, just finding those spaces. So I'm actively surveying, I'm moving into focus groups. I'm hoping to build a whole body of data and research, much like we go to the Pew data, we go to our internal data banks at our various institutions. Even though, data does have limitations, and in many ways, people do consider data at times a colonial effort, but owning our own knowledge, being able to pull out our own knowledge, that's the root of that. And then Chris Pattern is just my expression of bringing together everything, Black joy, and specifically, I've been very passionate about lately, specifically in this pandemic, around supply chains, and not just supply chains, but labor. And I think about specifically, I started doing fiber art, specifically crocheting and embroidery and a little bit of sewing for my own mental health to cope with the disparities and the fact that it's still very hard to enter into many of these spaces. It's still difficult to find joy and to practice and to be heard and seen, as we're having this conversation this morning, for a purpose, in mainstream firms, in local governments, in state, provincial governments, federally, wherever we are sitting in the different jurisdictional boundaries. So for me, being able to carry my fiber with me, and in this particular, I just took this last Saturday. It was Local Yarn Store Day. This is a local yarn store that's committed to being anti-racist and queer friendly, but even in those spaces, and fiber is just now learning, okay, making peace with the fact that labor issues need to be changed, environmental things need to happen. We need to be mindful of the type of fiber that we use in our work, and that just being able to sit around in a circle as we do in fiber spaces, it can be fraught with hearing and being a site of just harm, of people just not understanding, or either you have to be exceptional or you have to explain yourself. And I just want to, Chris Pattern is just the beginning of that creation. And, I found this stock image of a Black woman. I don't know if she's running the store. And of course, I'm assuming womanhood here, that this person, I'm assuming, of course, Black womanhood here, but still, people of color, Black, Indigenous, many of us, specifically those of us in of African descent who have folks who are enslaved, and even specifically for folks in my hometown who worked in textile mills. We were employed, and this was something that we had to do, but I want this to become a site of joy. And then, of course, activities like this, where I'm able to receive resources, financial, physical, from telling my story. I want to turn that back around and have this space wherever I am, whether it's a temporary space or whether it's a permanent space, wherever I make my primary home in the future, that myself and my partner, who does a lot of public health advocacy in the queer and trans community, that we can have a place to come to do this work that is fixed, where people know where to find us, where people know where to find their people. So that's the where, who, what, where, why of my work. I've been so delighted to be here with all of you this morning, going into this afternoon. I've learned so much, and thank you so much for having me.
Thank you so much, Kristen. Thank you so much. We have now our last presenter, Wenyu.
Hello. Thank you, Hansy. Nice to meet you here.
Nice to see you, Wenyu. Wenyu and I taught in Hangzhou for the Chinese Academy of Art, and Wenyu was my boss. She was wonderful.
Thank you. And I share my screen, but I need to translate. My English so poor, so I should speak Chinese.
Thank you, Lu.
那麻烦那个小王你帮我翻译。
可以。
我今天讲的是我们其中的一个项目，文村的设计和建造。那么我今天讲的内容其实主要针对的是建造策略这一部分。你先翻吧。
I'm going to present today the design and construction of Wencun, and I'm going to focus on the construction side of the story.
这个项目是2014年开始建设，到2013年就已经开始设计了。实际上这个项目目前还没有完全的完成。那我想给大家介绍一下，这个文村离杭州非常的近哈，可以看到这个区域。
So this project started to be designed in 2013 and still an ongoing project, and it started construction in 2014, and it's really close to Hangzhou, a major city in China that's close to Shanghai.
这个村子在我们所在的地区是非常的普通，可以看到我们做设计和改造之前这样的一个面貌。
You could see that the place is actually pretty ordinary before we started our construction.
这是一个已经几乎看不到过去样子的一个非常残破的一个村。这是我们做的那个调研的立面，你们可以看到改造之前的样子。
So this is the section of Wencun, which was in a really rundown state, which is called semi-disabled.
我们在做的这个工作是对这个村子进行调研之后，设定了一些策略，可以看一下。
So
这个是对你先翻，不好意思。
The Handlxrs studio actually designed these set of strategies after we run our analysis and site plan.
这个村子大概有100户的人家，你看到我分了1期、2期和3期3个部位。1期是我们当初设计的那个新建的区域，2期是原先的老村，混合了有他们村民自己建的，3期是现在正在建设的过程当中。
So this project was divided into 3 phases. Phase 1 is mostly the newly constructed households, and then the phase 2 is the old neighborhood, and then the phase 3 is what's going on right now. We're still constructing it, and then overall there are around 100 households in this neighborhood.
我想告诉大家的是，其实在中国的农村是几乎没有建筑师为村民直接设计居住的房子。那么我们这个项目其实做的那个我们这个项目其实是做了一个尝试性的一个实验性工作。1期是作为一个示范， 想希望能够通过我们的设计，对这个地区的村民进行一些
So normally there isn't an architect for any of the designs for the rural side of China. So we really try to model through our phase 1 design to showcase that, to showcase the design for the following phases.
我们在这个1期的试验区做新房子的这个区域设计了大约8种的类型，大约有24种的变体。那么我们想再根据不同的这个区域，让村民根据他的这个需要来进行一些选择。
So we designed 8 different typologies with 24 alternative models. So the rural migrants, they can actually choose the best fitted model for their home.
这张是在这个2期，就是新老混合的区域，我们选定了一些准备拆除的一些房子，进行新的设计，但是需要和村民讨论，他们有的是不希望我们拆掉他们的房子，所以在这个区域里就充分的和村民沟通。
So these households are what we picked out to be destructed, but then we actually ran workshops with the villagers in the area to discover the best way to go forward instead of total destruction.
事实的结果，村民并没有完全接受我们的设计，他们很多是只希望我们改造了它的立面，并不希望要新的房子。
But even after the workshop, a lot of villagers did not concede with our design. They actually want to move forward with only changing their facade.
我们看一下这个村子的前后的一些变化，这是在这个改造之前的村的状态。
So this is Wenyu before the renovation.
这张是我们做了一些立面的修改和新建筑的加入之后的状态。
This is the current state where we changed the facade and it constructed some of the houses.
这个是介于2期和3期之间的一个交界部位，改造之前的状态。
This is where that's in between phase 2 and phase 3 before the renovation.
这个是已经改造之后了。
This is after the renovation.
左边是3期，我想在这里需要介绍一下，3期是3期的这个房子在我们1、2期改造完之后，迟到今天为止才开始动手，大概已经有将近的5年过去了。
So we just started the construction of phase 3, which is 5 years after our initial design.
这个是在改造过程当中，村民们的期待和我们的设计其实是不完全一样的。他们会以为我们会改造他们左边的这些很破的房子，右边的这个是他们自己造的新房子。结果我们给他做的改造，你们可以看一下，我们保留了过去的老房子，而是对他们新做的房子的立面进行了一些处理。
So there's actually a disparity between what the villagers expected and what we actually did. So you could see that we actually kept all the older structures while changed whatever that was built in later day at the back.
还是这个部位右侧端部，这里有一群小房子，他们是猪圈和那个鸡窝，他们以为我们会把它拆掉，实际上我们给它做了一些改造。你们可以看到现在的这个状态是成为了这个村里现在唯一的一个餐厅，特色餐厅。
So basically we renovated where they raised their stocks. They expected that we were gonna really remove the stocks, but actually we built a restaurant there, which is now the focus of this village.
好的，我就快的把它翻一遍吧，好吗？
So I'll just flip through the slides to give a showcase of what the life in Wenyu today is like.
好了。
So that's all.
Thank you so much, Wenyu, and all the presenters. I know that we have till 12, and I hope that maybe you guys can stay longer for just 10 more minutes, maybe till 12:10, if that's okay. So we can have at least some conversation going. That would be fantastic. So I'm going to I just want to thank everyone. I felt like just hearing from the panelists today, I felt like this is what the seminar also felt for us every week, that it was just a space of joy, a space for us to have mentorship. And I'm hoping that by bringing in many panelists and speakers, that we somehow feel connected and can create networks within the students, within you, and to advance kind of the work, right? So I'm going to really give it to our students to begin the dialogue.
I can ask the first question. Thank you all so much. I think some of you already touched on this, but my question was, in general, how do you ensure that your practices is not reinforcing mistakes of the past or harmful? And then what types of measures or self-reflection do you do to kind of judge your own work?
I'm happy to respond to that one if that's okay. Thank you for the question. We talked about this a little bit, I think, but in my mind, participatory iterative processes grounded in good relationship is a fundamental starting point, with an explicit focus on self-determination are some of the ways that we try and prevent doing harm. So rather than coming into a new project saying, this is what we think you need to do, this is how others do their strategic planning, we're always starting off by sitting down with people saying, how can this process feel good for you, work for you, given your current mental state and capacity, and what do you see that needs to be done, and how can we work together? And that's been really effective, and our goal is always to be in good relationship at the end of the project, regardless of the deliverable or the outcome. And then in terms of self-reflection, I'd love to hear from others as well, but for me, it's, going back to the nested system, it's like trusting the body as barometer of the quality of our interactions. And so we talk about this in the company a lot, like if you have a gut feeling that something's off about a project, we encourage everyone to investigate that and recognize that the emotional space, the somatic space, can help you recognize conflict or harm before even your intellectual space can comprehend or analyze it. So we try and take a holistic approach to our work, I guess, where it's feeding into everyone's well-being in those holistic dimensions.
And I'll step in a little bit here, just basically knowing what you love to do. That's why I really have brought back fiber and drawing and music, and because you can't just create on top of people. That's not what this is about. And even if people that look like you are also members of a group of color or a queer group or whatever marginalizations or what perceived marginalizations that we have had, that doesn't mean that the whole project is what we need. And then sometimes you're not necessarily the right person to usher a project to completion. So knowing that distinction, and while you're in school right now, I don't know if people are graduating in the next couple of weeks. I don't know. And of course, it's almost like we're graduating, all of us are graduating back into the world now that we're looking at vaccination in many countries, and some places are still we're figuring out through that. But knowing yourself, creating for your own self, and keeping creation for yourself, and then giving yourself the flexibility, especially as you're starting your career. You may need to go work somewhere to get a sense of what the world is like, or pay bills or whatever, and then you can make that decision and be active about where you go next. But specifically sitting in the Black intersection, the Black femme intersection, yes, this is a time to reclaim yourself. This is a time to be yourself. This is a time to assert yourself. Don't let anyone tell you that it's an ego trip or anything like that. But just make sure that you're being mindful of your site, where you're doing it, being mindful of the fact that many of us either are immigrated here or have been brought here, and making that connection. So be yourself, love your creative practice, love your creative work and your, professional work, but also be mindful of the fact that everybody else needs to have that piece to do that.
Yeah, I think that one thing that I always come back to is Adrienne Marie Brown's quote of like, move at the speed of trust. And with that being said, I think moving beyond like one-time transactional sort of like interactions to like long-term collaborations is something that for me, seeing each other grow throughout time is actually that, like, I've seen that with friends and collaborators, and it sort of brings this accountability, but also this humbling sense of like unlearning together and also shaping something bigger together.
Claire, can you translate for Wenyu too, so Lou can respond to the question?
Yes, I actually just asked Professor, and she responded that she respects the intention and the comments by the villagers. So from the project, you can see there were lots of designs that being done, the 24 models, but actually if the villagers didn't want it, she would not impose that on them. So there was this iterative process where there was a discussion within with the villagers and total respect for what they want it to be. So if they didn't want it, they will keep it as what it was.
Thank you.
要我补充吗？
可以，您想补充什么？
我想补充的是，这个项目其实一开始的时候，村民确实不是很想要，所以当时第一批只有10几户的村民同意签了协议，要了这些房子，但是实际上2年之后建成，他们都后悔了。
So basically, when the project first started, nobody wanted it.
没有要房子的人后悔了。
Okay, only a handful, like 10 plus people signed a contract, but when they saw how it was done, the rest actually regretted it. So that's why there was a phase 2 and phase 3 following.
第3期我们现在正在做的更有意思，因为我们给了他们的设计，它其实不是我们给他建，是村民自己去建。他想建成什么样，我们到今天为止实际上是不知道的。
So phase 3 is even more interesting because it actually gave the power back to the villagers. So they gave design back to the villagers and then asked them to construct it themselves. So they had the total liberty of changing the design. And so the studio actually didn't know how it actually would look like when the construction is finished.
That's wonderful. That's great. Josias, you had a question as well.
Yeah, I wanted to thank everyone. It's really nice being in a space with Black, Indigenous, queer, immigrant, and third world people of color. It's always nice like being in those spaces, and I think in general this semester has been very grounding. As a person of color, being in this class as an undergraduate, in my second year being in this like course, and esa pregunta es para Marcela. And anybody can jump in at this question, but in the beginning you mentioned arbitrary rules that are present in design, and I think this extends to art and architecture and all these other forms of performance and design. And I was wondering how we as non-binary artists and designers exist in but not of these spaces and these museums, and more closely, how do we reimagine and rebuild these like museums and sites of archives for our work?
Boom, I question myself that every day. Thank you for your questions, for your kind words. I mean, for me, like when I was like learning about art, there was always this idea of like the genius that is in their studio 24/7 and then like suddenly becomes an artist. And to me, it's like succeeding alone just seems like so sad. Like that nothing's better than like we uplift each other, right? And for me, like my artist community and like showing up for each other and for each other's things and like uplifting each other's work is actually one of the most important parts of my practice, right? So I think that is one part that like now I see where like a lot of my friends work in different institutions and we're just like, you're doing this project, let me leverage it and like let's collaborate it so that it becomes bigger. And we always think about like pipelines too. Like I didn't have a queer mentor until I was like 24 and I arrived to California and I met like queer older folks and I was just like, they have all the answers, and I've never seen this before. And so for me also, like, intergenerational mentorship has become so important, both for folks that are older than me, but also people that are younger. And since we are all committed to this long-term work that we're doing, I think that like creating like sustainable pipelines for young folks is like one of the most important parts to like move these disciplines forward.
And can I just pop in real quick on the non-binary femme side of things? You don't owe gender performance to anybody, especially not westernized, Eurocentric, and of course, even some of our people of color assimilated demands, classes, capitalistic demands. So as I said before, just keep being yourself, your beautiful self, and let the world know who you are, define yourself for yourself, and keep showing up. And of course, find us where we are.
I can ask another question. This is for Lily, but really, I would invite anyone to jump in. And also, thank you all so much for being here. So, Lily, in your work with CoDesign, which you founded, I'm curious as to how CoDesign is transforming the like traditional and problematic relationship between universities and the anchor communities that they kind of exist in, but also are parasites on. And I was wondering how you built relationships with community organizations and also how CoDesign is integrating new principles and practices that you've learned from community partners.
Thanks for the question on it. I think, and this partly touches on Lillian's question too, about how to not repeat the problems of the past. I think with traditional knowledge production or even artistry, you know, at places like Harvard or, you know, other powerful institutions, there's such a ownership aspect, like trying to claim things, claim knowledge, claim, you know, being the first at something or being the innovator. And it's just not true, you know? And so acknowledging that and really working with communities and like place-based leaders, I think it's more honest. I think the work goes further. That kind of individualistic, like knowledge and cultural production of claiming and striving and, you know, being in the limelight, it's very draining, you know, and it's short-sighted. So I think a lot of this is like, okay, if we want to do impactful work, if we have like this planetary existential crisis, if we're all hurting, like dying from white supremacy and patriarchy and, you know, just the internalized colonialism as well, like how can we start by building new relationships and building new ways of creating together? So I think like working in relationship, working in community, being based in history and context and adding to that rather than trying to claim and own is really important. I also want to say, because CoDesign has been a really creative and liberating space, but it's also coming to an end. I'm actually transitioning to Northeastern next month or next month. I'm going to be starting a new stint there as assistant professor of race and social justice in the built environment. So please come visit me there. I hope that I can continue to collaborate with those in this room. And you can reach me at lilysong@gmail.com in the interim. That's my personal email.
I can ask a question next. And again, thank you so much for all being here. It's been so amazing to hear you all speak. My question is for Roberta Washington specifically. Do you consider professional organizations to be more oriented towards change or stagnancy within the discipline? And how does this differ between interest organizations like NOMA and umbrella organizations like the AIA? What steps can the professional organization and its members take to spur change and diversification within the discipline?
Okay, how much time? 2 minutes? Okay. Okay, that's a good question. And I ask myself that question almost every day, and I was just discussing it.
I was hoping, Roberta, I was hoping to maybe, if everyone's okay, to aim for 12:15. Is that good?
Yeah, I mean, okay. I mean, I just don't want to, use too much time myself. But So I think that those are really good questions, and I don't think that I yet have the answers, but I think that there's still a lot of work to be done. And part of what I see is that some organizations, it's hard to not call names though. Let's see. So I think that some organizations maybe change over certain periods or during certain periods, or respond to what's happening, at a particular time and seem to change. But that doesn't mean that the core values of the organization change just because of that, because then they can slip back into their traditional view of things later on. So it's hard to know if some statements that organizations feel obliged to give because of what's happened in the last year, what those are based on, and it's only like time will tell. And at the same time, I think that organizations like NOMA also have to look at how they want to respond to new situations. And for instance, I think one is that for the longest time, NOMA, for instance, like only had a majority of Black members, and if they had a competition, like there's a student competition for design, which over the years have become less Black and more, which is fine, except if the intent is to booster some minority students, maybe we, in a sense, an organization can shift to a point where we are so open and so accepting and whatever of all kinds of cultures that we forget the reason that the organization started. And so now it's like, I think that the original message from the founders probably needs to be just looked at and compared to what's really happening these days. And so I think all organizations still have a lot of work to do if our goals really are to be inclusive. We still have some work to do.
Thank you so much, Roberta. James is going to ask the last question.
Yeah, thank you for this panel discussion. It's amazing. And I have the last question to Wenyu, and I will ask in English first and then translate in Chinese. So how do you see that there are more famous male architects in China? And more specifically, how do you think the distribution of fame between your partner and you after you both won the Pritzker Prize? 所以陆老师，我想问一下，在中国，男性建筑师的曝光率远比女性建筑师要更高。然后作为一位杰出的女性建筑师，您是如何看待这个现象的？以及您和您的丈夫一起获得了普利兹克建筑奖，您是如何看待这个奖项带来的名誉影响，以及这份名誉在您和丈夫之间的分配呢？
好大的一个问题，我都不知道该怎么回答了。其实我觉得，我在做建筑师的时候，不会刻意认为自己是个女建筑师。我觉得可能在工作当中的时候，你会忘记你的性别，所以不会去特意的去想这样的一个问题。麻烦你翻译一下吧。
So this is a really big question. I almost don't know how to answer it. But when I work, I actually would not remember my gender. So my gender actually fades when I work. I don't remember that I'm a woman architect in particular. So I'm just retreated to my role as an architect.
Thank you. Thank you so much for your response, Lou. I want to take the time to kind of close and respect everyone's time because they still have class. And so I just want to let the panelists and the audience member know that our intention of bringing all of things together is to archive it, to write about your contributions, what you do, what you work, and to put it together in the Students Collective Project, which is the rethinking the timeline, transforming the timeline. And part of the funding that I received was to make it available. So we hope that we can have this work and share it with you and ask permission to share it with the larger. And the idea is to just ensure that the work is visible. And I think I was really struck by Lily's question in the beginning, like hidden figures to whom? And I think that Kristen kind of answered that in her dialogue, which is, or Marcela, that, you know, they didn't have a mentor or an academic that taught the work until later, or that the community was the actual teacher. And I think that part of the framing of the courses as of hidden figures is that, you know, even if it's true what you say, even in academia, lots of these courses are still seen as in addition to. And so I think it's really not necessarily about for whom. I think it's really to let students know that are entering into the university that is to provide a space for them to kind of recognize that there is a history, that someone is talking about it. So I think the hidden is still very relevant in academia, in institutions. And so, you know, I just want to, you know, thank everyone and thank the students and thank all the lecturers and panelists for sharing your work. So thank you so much. And we will write about this and we will share it with you. So thank you for participating.
Thank you.
Thank you. Have a great evening.
Yes.